Romantasy. It's one of the hottest genres right now. Everybody's talking about it. It has a ton of fans. With books like A Court of Thorn and Roses and The Fourth Wing, it has a ton of fans. And it also has provoked a fair amount of ire as well as confusion, particularly about what exactly makes a book a romantasy and how do you define it? A lot of people come to the conclusion that a romantasy is a fantasy novel with the primary plot being a romance. But I'm going to argue in this video that it kind of goes beyond that what is giving you that romantasy vibe is more than just whether the main plot thread is a romance or not. Do these books belong in the fantasy section at all? And why do people hate them so much? My name is Lydia Foxglove, and I'm a fantasy writer. My background is going to be very pertinent in this video because I kind of went on a journey through various genres within and adjacent to romantasy over the years. And so this is gonna be a bit of a personal narrative. First, I want to say that I have talked extensively about how I feel that people should write whatever makes them happy, and you should read whatever makes you happy as well. I would much rather see people voraciously reading silly, spicy books, tropey books, whatever, than just plopping yourself in front of the TV and mindlessly scrolling. Books are still engaging your mind. They're just something about them I think is good for the brain. Also, life is already short enough and stressful enough that nobody should guilt you into saying you shouldn't read any particular thing. I don't want to judge anybody, but with that said, I don't really love romantasy. So this video is going to get into a bit of yucking on some people's yum, which I don't usually do. But I think that in this case, it's important for the context of the discussion. So if you're really sensitive about it, know that I am 100% cool with you loving whatever it is that you love, but I am like a tiny bit irritated with romantasy. And part of that is because I've written it and I've always written fantasy with a romantic plot line. So backing up a little bit, I was a tween teenager in the 90s and we didn't really have young adult yet. I was a voracious reader. I read a lot of adult books. I read The Mists of Avalon, Outlander, various big old chonky historical and fantasy novels, including some that had spicy scenes. I was basically always looking for books that had a romantic plotline and had a hot boy, and there weren't a lot. Some of the books we did have at the time were Mercedes Lackey's novels, Tamara Pierce, as well as a lot of comics I was reading, like the ElfQuest comics, but it was hard to find what I really wanted. Now, there was a romance genre, of course, and they generally had, the covers with the bodice rippers and the shiny letters and, all that, your Fabio type guys. I read a few of those, but I did not really like them, so I never really became a romance reader at all. I was pretty much always a reader of fantasy, of kidlit, classics, nonfiction. Those were the main things that I read, as well as comics, a lot of comics. Manga came along. That definitely scratched my itch for what I was looking for. The Fushigi Yugi manga, Paradise Kiss, some of those early shoujo releases, that was my jam. And then we started to get young adult novels. By this time, I myself was an adult who was aspiring to be a writer. And I always thought that I would be a fantasy writer. But then young adult came along, and when it was new, it kind of seemed like the genres were somewhat blurred, and a lot of things that were not in fantasy were allowed in young adult. So my first novel was somewhat of a gas lamp, Victorian-inspired historical fantasy, a little bit of a riff on Jane Eyre. This novel, Magic Under Glass, ended up being my debut novel in 2009. And around this time, I was reading a ton of young adult novels. And I had many friends who were also young adult authors and I was in the scene. And even at this point, I noticed that there was sort of a divide in perspective between people who came into young adult from romance and people who came into young adult from any other genre, mostly from kidlit and from fantasy, with a few people sprinkled in who were into mystery, horror, like classic literature primarily. But most of us were kidlit and fantasy people that wanted to recapture the feeling that we had the first time we read something like Anne of Green Gables or Howl's Moving Castle or Alana the First Adventure or Harry the Spy or whatever novel it was that you loved when you were 10, 12, 13. We wanted to recapture that feeling. That was how I felt. I really loved the idea, actually, of writing young adult because I thought that a lot of my readers would probably, like a lot of readers of teen books are actually a little younger. I'm fine with teens reading them too. And there were starting to be a larger adult contingent as well. But I wanted to like that like 12-year-old girl, the inner me, that was reading The Mists of Avalon, which wasn't even a kid's book at all. But I wanted that kind of energy. I was thinking about like the tween girl reader. The romance readers seem to be coming at it more from a place of, I want to write my fantasy. I want to write about a girl who kicks supreme ass and hot boy, you know, nothing wrong with that. It was a different vibe and often resulted in a book that made me go a little bit, particularly some of the ones that featured a very toxic relationship that I felt no teenager in any circumstance in any timeline would have a relationship like this, or if they did, we would not all be enabling it. We would be very alarmed. Now, there was a lot of this conversation at the time as to whether teens were being corrupted by reading paranormal books about dominating vampires who like to watch them sleep, fallen angels, werewolves who are all bad boys, and, you know. I certainly read a few things that were problematic as a kid, and it didn't instantly ruin me, so I'm not overly alarmist about it, but it was a little weird to me to see adults choosing to write this sort of thing for a teenage audience. But I don't know to what degree they were really even thinking about it that way. There were starting to be increasingly more and more adults reading young adult anyway. But it was a broad genre. There wasn't as much in the way of firm tropes yet. They definitely existed, but we didn't have as much in the way of like hashtags, and there was certainly no book talk. And there were a number of romantic fantasies I really enjoyed during this time, like Graceling. So as a reader, I was having a good time. By the time we got to like 2015, 2016, I had 5 young adult novels out. None of them had really blown up. And if you've had a couple of novels come out and not really go anywhere, it starts to get harder to sell one, especially if you can't come up with something that's like more commercial, more high concept. This was not really the kind of writer that I was. So I decided to take a look at indie publishing. If you followed this channel for a while, you'll know that I have a fantasy world that I've been developing since I was a kid. And it was really my dream to tell stories set in this fantasy world. I thought that indie publishing might be a venue for me to do this. But I also realized that I had to find somewhere to fit it into the market. Where were my readers going to be? I needed to make money doing this. So I had to find some kind of way to market it and have it appeal to a specific audience. And that was when, for the very first time in my life, I started reading romance. Because fantasy romance or romantic fantasy, whatever you want to call it, it was starting to pop a little bit in indie publishing, and I thought I could get in on this. I've always written fantasy novels with romantic plots, so this is kind of the first time I've seen this genre really starting to have a broad audience, and I want to get in on it. So I read a handful of these books trying to figure out like what are the things that mark this genre. My initial takeaways is that there's a lot of attraction between the main characters, like physical attraction. There's periodic sex scenes in many of the popular ones, sometimes in somewhat unrealistic contexts. Like, this is fantasy, and I don't mean fantasy in the genre term. I mean where your head's going kind of fantasy. And at this point, I noticed that there were a lot of books in which nothing really happened except the romance. Like, there'd just be kind of like some like cute little getting to know you scenes without a lot of like tension or plot momentum. And I thought that was interesting because I had been in traditional publishing where agents and editors always tell you tension on every page. The protagonist has to have all these obstacles. They have to overcome them. You have to escalate the stakes, all these rules. And in the romantic fantasy I was reading, that kind of went out the window. A lot of times not that much was happening. It was just like, here's a romance. Here's like a loose conflict of like why he's a little strange to her because he's kind of a monster species and it's an arranged marriage. But then you could just kind of like have them sort of float along, going on a little, he invites her to dinner and he's sexy and then she's attracted to him. The tension is like extremely low. So with these things in mind, I wrote the Cursed Soul trilogy, my first adult romantic fantasy. And I tried to incorporate all those elements that I had noticed, such as the characters are very attracted to each other, and I tried to remind the reader of that periodically, like every chapter or two. They had more sex than I had ever imagined any of my characters ever having. There were a lot of it was more character driven than I had been sort of trained to write. There were battle scenes and other fantasy things going on, but it tended to be more about their relationship and it was kind of a them against the world story. So I wrote this series and it did pretty well, but I definitely missed the mark on what this genre really was because I'd only really read a few romances and just gone from there and kind of done my own thing, just kind of jamming in a few things. There wasn't really a real popular trope to this book or anything. I also just it really does read to me more like it's the story of the protagonist kind of finding herself and becoming empowered in a situation where she is very powerless. The male lead in the book, he has real flaws, as in things that me and my friends might discuss with our own partners, little tiny micro things. Or there's moments where Velsa gets irritated at him for very realistic reasons. There's a scene where they've adopted this daughter and he buys a cake and is basically being the fun dad, and she starts to feel kind of he's oblivious to all of the bad things going on and is kind of the daughter might like him more than her because she's actually taking on the burden of there's actually bad stuff going on and I'm being realistic about it and you're over here buying a cake. That's not a really romancy type of scenario, but I tended to be really interested in the minutiae of relationships as a writer, and I just wrote what I knew. I hadn't read a lot of romance, so I didn't know that that's not the vibe. The next series I tried flopped badly, so then I thought, okay, I really need to figure out what romance is all about and really study the trends and read a bunch of them, really get to know what makes a romance and how can I sell more books. And this was during the time when indie publishing was really starting to take. 50 Shades of Grey had already been hot, and now there were starting to be indie authors being bestsellers all over the place. And a lot of tropes and trends were popping up, and if you could get in on the right one, you would make money. One of the genres that started to become extremely popular during this time was reverse harem, which is kind of a polyamorous genre where you have one girl who, for whatever reason, has multiple guys who are all interested in her and they all agree to share her and she agrees to share them. Sometimes there's other variants, two of the guys are also in love with each other, or there's a woman in the harem. This genre is also sometimes called Why Choose. If you're in on indie romance publishing, you totally know what this is. And if you are not in on it, you're going to be what? But that's true of a lot of things in indie publishing. There were whole genres an alien kidnapping a girl and taking her to his home planet and being you're mine, or bear shifters. I learned about all these things, and at first it was what? Women are reading stories about guys who shapeshift into bears? That's weird. And after a while, you're just no, that's not weird at all. There's a million of those. That's just kind of normal. I'm not even fazed by it. So I read many of these books, and I started to get a more instinctive feel for what made these books popular with readers. And then I started incorporating those into my books. And recently, I went back and I was rereading my Kingdoms of Sky and Shadow series. This book shares a lot of DNA with the book I published recently, The Broken Queen. The Broken Queen takes place in my actual fantasy world. Kingdoms of Sky and Shadow was a reverse harem epic fantasy romance. And on the surface, you would think these books are both romantasy. They're the same genre. It's just that one of them is reverse harem and the other one is just a guy and a girl. But when I went back and reread Kingdoms, which I hadn't read since I wrote it, I really realized the difference between this current romantasy and what makes a book more of like a fantasy with a primary romantic plot line. It's more than just this is a book in a fantasy setting that has a romance as the main plot. There are like underlying things that this is somewhat of a generalization. There is like a spectrum, and you will find books that are extremely conforming to trope and some that are just in that middle gray area, and then you'll find some that are not tropey at all. They're just a book that has a romance in a fantasy world. But if you've read a lot of these romantasy books, you are going to know a lot of what I'm talking about. So the way that I wrote Kingdoms of Sky and Shadow, because I was pulling my influences from other popular books, is that every scene is framed through the tropes and the fantasies. So especially since Book Talk came along, it's very common for romance to be framed around a trope. This book is enemies to lovers. This book has shadow daddy. This book has, princess and a bodyguard. There's so many, but people will market their books based on like a menu of tropes. And when you're writing the book as a writer, like a really commercial book, every scene is through the filter of what is that fantasy, what fantasy is associated with that trope. So you might say the fantasy is this girl is a total badass. She's an assassin. She can kill people in 5 seconds, but she's never been in love. She's cold and hard. And then she runs into her mortal enemy, the guy who killed her parents. He's super hot, and he manages to, with his cold yet sexy ways, melt her own cold heart. And when they fall in love, it sparks fly and, the tension's off the charts. So every scene in the whole book is going to be written with this fantasy in mind. It might be like, man protect woman, but woman prove she also strong. So if you have a battle, the characters are thinking of it through the framework of, I must protect my woman, and he's protecting me, and I'm so glad about that, but I can fight for myself, and I'm going to show him. When I am writing a scene in like a normal fantasy book of mine, I am not thinking of that framework. I'm just thinking about these characters like normal people, and they might feel like they want to protect each other. They might have some of those feelings because they're normal feelings to have in some cases, but I'm not like layering it on thick as I'm writing the scene. There might be a whole battle where they're mainly thinking about like the strategy of how to execute the battle. They might be wrapped up in some more internal problems that don't even have anything to do with the person that they love. They probably have a lot of things going on in their head. Their lives are a little more well-rounded and not completely focused around this relationship dynamic. But when I was writing these reverse harem romances, I would always have that in the back of my head. Every scene, whether it was political intrigue or set a battle or anything, I would always keep in mind that trope and that dynamic between the characters and like bring it into the scene somewhere. Another thing that they would often have is more modern language. Like if you've read The Fourth Wing, for example, that was a bit of a polarizing thing for like fantasy readers versus romance readers. And there was a book, I don't remember the title of it anymore, but there was a fantasy romance that was hot in 2016 and people were recommending it to me to read. And I read like 40 pages and I was like, I cannot stand the modern dialogue. It just throws me out of the fantasy world completely. Why do they talk so modern if they're in a fantasy world? And I'm not like the most stringent person with this in my own fantasy world, but like this, there's a level where I'm like, this is too much. And The Fourth Wing was also like that for me. But when I was writing my romantasy, I definitely threw in more of that kind of thing because that's just like readers want that first person and they want like very relatable, casual dialogue. I mean, again, I'm generalizing. You personally, the reader, might not want that, but it's clear that it is popular. Another common thing with these books is that they will have these themes of like, you know, they might have social justice and dealing with racism and feminism and like all of these bigger topics that fantasy novels might deal with at any time that make you kind of feel like there's something important going on. And yet I've seen frequent criticism that these themes tend to ring a little hollow somehow. Some people have speculated that the reason that they ring hollow is because they're based in a very like traditional romance dynamic of like protective man, maybe even somewhat of a toxic man, dominating man that can somewhat undermine the female empowerment. But that doesn't explain like why do other themes of like social justice or not discriminating against people, why do these seem like they just don't really hit very hard in romantasy a lot of the time? And I think that by running every scene through the filter of like the romantic trope, and also it kind of simplifies whatever theme you want to put in, and they often don't really tread on very fresh territory. Like, we can pretty much all agree in a broad sense that like racism bad. And if you have a race of like pink elves that's bad to the blue elves, then everybody's like, that's bad. But they rarely get into like the deep minutiae of how did this start? How does it perpetuate even in our modern world? They don't delve too deeply into the dynamics between like a man and a woman in a marriage. That was one of the mistakes that I don't think of it as a mistake. I love that book, but that was one of the things I did in the Cursed Soul trilogy. And I think Outlander is one example of a book that is very romantic and has fantasy elements and has many sex scenes, but it gets pretty deep into the relationship between Claire and Jamie and like their dynamics. So even though it has a lot of the elements of romantasy, I don't feel like that's a romantasy. So in short, I think that the thing that primarily defines this romantasy vibe that people can't quite seem to pinpoint is that it is fantasy forward. And again, when I say fantasy, I mean the fantasy of a woman being strong or a woman being the chosen one who never knew she had powers and then meeting a guy who's knocks her socks off and has these particular tropes, whether it's bad boy or evil sorcerer who's brooding and untouchable, the guard that's been protecting her since she was a kid and has never made a move, you know. There's different tropes, and those tropes take precedence over everything else and color every scene in the book. So even when you have maybe some pretty solid world building or some unique ideas or some deeper themes, often it just doesn't really hit very hard because what the book's priority is satisfying this trope and its associated fantasy. To me, that's like the difference between a romantasy and a romance with fantasy elements versus a fantasy novel that has a romantic plot line, even an extremely prominent, like it's the main plot of the entire book. If the focus of this romance is not on the fantasy of the romance, but is on the relationship between two real people dealing with real problems, and the world building has effects on them and the social dynamics of the world have effects on their relationship, that is not a romance novel in the sense that we're currently mostly understanding it. And I'm sure that some of the comments here are going to disagree with me because, again, there's a lot of shades of gray. Do I want to use that metaphor? There's a lot of, you know, variance between these two hard extremes. And there's also a lot of judgment on people who go for the more tropey, sexy, fantasy-driven story versus the people who maybe have more lofty, I want to really get into the characters and their interpersonal dynamics against the scope of the geopolitical environment. And there's snobbery there that can make people defensive. And I know that just by discussing this, I might provoke some of that defensiveness. But the problem as a writer in this context is that if I write a book that is set in a fantasy world and has a romance plotline at the core of it, now it gets automatically considered to be romantasy and lumped in with it. Or I can try to market it in such a way that gets totally away from that. But then I have a problem because, where do I put that in the marketplace? How else do I even market it? Because there's no real vibe for the alternative. So I did market The Broken Queen more like a romantasy, and I don't know if that was correct because it's not really filtered entirely through the tropes and the sexual attraction and all of that between the characters. It's just got a little more of an old school fantasy vibe, like Mercedes Lackey's books, Anne McCaffrey or Sharon Shin. I don't know how to market books like that currently because romantasy is just such a huge, it's the dragon in the room that's taking up all the space right now. And I can also understand that if you are primarily a fantasy reader, whether you are male or female, and whether you like romantic plot lines in your fantasy, you can feel a little irritated right now because you want the fantasy novel where the characters are more like real people and are not filtered through some kind of tropey fantasy. But it's hard to find right now. I know I'll go to Barnes & Noble and I'll be reading the backs of books and it'll describe something, some kind of romantic scenario. And at this point, if it sounds anything like a trope, if it has a whiff of a Raylo or a Dramione or a enemies to lovers or anything, Shadow Daddy, you name it, I'm wary of it, even if I might like that dynamic in a realistic context. I don't really want to read it filtered through this tropey fantasy thing. So it can be very hard, both as a reader and a writer, to find and market a book that you're not dealing with the characters in that way. And this is definitely a source of frustration because it's not easy to explain. You can't just say, I don't want to read fantasy books where romance is the main plot line. That is not true. I love a main romance plot line in a fantasy. But what I do want to filter out for myself personally is the ones where characters are in the middle of political intrigue and they're mainly thinking about their sexual tension, or they're having sex at unrealistic times, or they're just badasses beyond any kind of realism. I personally just don't really want that, and it's very hard to find books like that right now. So then what can you do? You can go read books that aren't romantic or aren't described as romantic at all. But if you actually like really character-driven plot lines with some romance, then it's very hard to find what you want to read. And it will be interesting to see where it goes because I'm increasingly starting to see weariness on the internet with every book being sold based on the trope menu. But it can also be hard to tell whether that is just the loud minority or whether there is going to be any real hunger for books that aren't just super tropey. And if so, how are we going to sell them to readers? I just wanted to make this video because I have gone through the experience of having to learn what the vibe of commercial romance novels are and how to filter my own work and voice through them, and then going back to what I really want to do. I'm really drawn to the social and cultural potential in fantasy novels, and that often does include the dynamics between men and women, including falling in love and in romantic relationships and marriages. I love writing a lot of romantic plot lines, and I don't know where the place for that is. But mainly I wanted to say, a lot of people out there who are trying to explain the difference between romantic fantasy, and fantasy romance, that the reason that just saying fantasy romance is a fantasy with a primary romance plotline. The reason why that doesn't always quite seem to feel right is that it actually kind of goes deeper than that. I'm going to say that romantasy and fantasy romance are set in a fantasy world and then filtered through a trope that connects to more of a desire rather than being focused on realistic human behavior. And again, nothing wrong with that. I am fine with people having their fantasies, but that's just the most popular vibe. But if you think I'm off base on that, I guess you can let me know in the comments. I'm a little afraid what the comments on this video could be because I'm not really one to argue about stuff. I really just wanted to share my own experience of having to figure out what the heck commercial fantasy and paranormal romance are and what I learned from doing so. So I don't know. I'm not going to ask for any particular kind of comments. If you have opinions, I know you're going to tell me, and that's that. So I would, however, love to know what are your favorite fantasy novels with a major romantic plotline that are not tropey. Yeah, that's the comment I would really love. Tell me what books I should put on my very long to read list. And if you'd like more from me, this channel is generally about the writing life, both the practical, the creative, the financial. Sometimes we talk about books. So if that sounds good to you, click that subscribe button. And if you want even more from me, I have YouTube memberships turned on with bonus videos, as well as you can get them through my Patreon and Substack, where I also send out free emails about whatever now and then. Same content on both. And the paid tier on Substack and Patreon also gets you access to my Discord server with a great community of writers. And if you want to read any of my books, there's a link in the description. If you want the ones that are fantasy with a romantic plotline, but not romantasy, those are the Hidden Lands books. And the rest are all pretty much my commercial works. And beyond that, I will see you next time. Bye.